Y muy bienvenidos al mejor panel del día. Tengo que actuar con entusiasmo porque es después de almuerzo.
Enthusiastic because it's after lunch, and of course, this at this time of the day, interest tends to go down. I can present the panel. We have Captain Nicolas Pitrat, Defense Admiral of the Republic of France in Chile. Thank you very much for being with us. I would also like to introduce our dear friend Colonel Hutchinson of the British Embassy. Thank you for supporting us today. And I would like to introduce from Brazil General Etchegoyen, who I particularly thank for his effort to travel to be here at this seminar. He represents the Center for Sovereignty and Climate in Brazil. And finally, Captain of the Navy, Captain Sigfrido Ramírez, Sub-Director of the Maritime Interest Section of the Navy. So, I would like to welcome all these panel members in this panel for Green Defense. The first time I heard this was like a year and a half ago. Juan Pablo and Karen and me talked about this. She already had this idea. She was the reserve official of the Army of Chile, and he was already thinking of the climate change that had an impact on defense. For me, at that point, I found it interesting, but still very far away, and I wasn't that clear on it now. Now, a year and a half later, and of course the countries, European countries, are very much involved on the impact of climate change that it can have basically on the operations and the installations that we use. Facilities, of course, on operations, it will have impact on land, sea, and air. And Captain Pitrat will talk about this. In 1918, a hurricane destroyed the Tyndall base of the North American Air Force. That was destruction of $4.7 billion, but that was not the worst thing. The worst thing was how the base and the F-22 could not operate for several months. So this is a specific impact of climate change on defense. So without further ado, I give the microphone to Captain Pitrat, who will talk about the impact of climate change from French perspective. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, General. I'm very grateful for AthenaLab for this invitation. I'm sorry for my Chilean. Is this better? Yes. Sorry for my Chilean. I'll try to speak as best as possible. I won't talk about the risks because they were touched upon already this morning and very well developed. I will focus more on what the armed forces in France do, and particularly in the Pacific and this continent of South America, where France has lots of interest through its overseas territories. And we can also consider the poles, Antarctic, in this context. As an introduction, please allow me to talk about a personal anecdote. As a Marine Guard some years ago, I remember that every end of the day we did some shooting exercises to to shoot some waste into the sea, into the water, and now all the vessels are equipped. Even the oldest vessels separate waste and compact, and the most advanced ones have an incineration plant on board. So this has changed a lot. And for example, I've just come back from the Galapagos, where we have launched a new vessel, an overseas vessel, which fulfills the highest, or meets the highest demands in order to respect the environment. Later, on a patrol vessel, I was wondering the military role that we have in the glorious island in the Mozambique Channel. Every morning I would walk around the island to count the eggs of the tortoises, and now, because of the change of biosphere, this has changed a lot. And finally, when I was in the Talón de Tarawa, I saw that the inhabitants were planning for the disappearance of their island because its maximum height is 4 meters above sea level. These examples illustrate strong impacts of climate change, but they also introduce the important changes of over 20 years in terms of doctrine, training of the team. To end this introduction in a more dramatic way, as was mentioned this morning, I would like to mention that in the framework of, as part of the pandemic and the tension between Russia, the war between Russia and Ukraine, the climate has effects have catalyzed. So France has developed since April 2022 through the Ministry of Armed Forces a new strategy which is called Climate and Defense. This strategy first is in line and compatible with the dynamic guidelines in the European Union and NATO. And in January 2021, the European Union adopted a roadmap on climate change and defense. In June 2021, NATO adopted an action plan for climate change and safety. And we can also highlight November 2021, a joint statement of the Ministries of Defense on climate change and armed forces that was signed by 26 countries. So in April 2022, we published this strategy, and at the end of 2022, we developed a plan for orientation and actions to continue to follow this and develop this strategy until 2030. And coordinator for climate and defense is in charge of this in the Ministry of Armed Forces. This strategy, of course, was in the portfolio of defense since 2007, and it was updated frequently until the latest revision in 2021. France, as well as the United States and Spain, were the first countries to integrate climate change in a national strategy about the sea. Ours is from 2018, which is called National Strategy for Marine Areas, Zones, which was updated in 2019. And of course, for a long time, armed forces have been involved on sea, fighting against illegal fishing, contamination, on land, fighting illegal mining activities, and this with the goal of sustainable exploitation of natural resources. This way, we often have to carry the burden of unlimited fishing, and at the same time, we have also gone through the positive effect of control measures. But right now, the acceleration of impacts has also pushed towards the acceleration of these actions. That is the idea of this strategy. And like I said, to implement it, there is a coordinator now at ministerial level to develop this roadmap. The goals of this strategy are focused in a triple document, which is to adapt, focus and mitigate. Like we said this morning, it is worth highlighting that cooperation is key to anticipate and face the risks in this strategy. We have to anticipate future situations. Therefore, we have developed a climate change observatory. It's been in operation since 2016. It's also an observatory for the poles, because in our perspective, the poles, North Pole and the South Pole, belong to one single policy. This observatory was developed in 2015, and there is another observatory for energy flows and issues since 2019, because of course changes can have consequences for scarcity of resources. Multinational cooperation and international cooperation was developed as well as scientific cooperations, many agreements with national or international organizations. It has supported several theses, and also with the purpose of anticipating future efforts. We are studying the new health risks. For example, in the south of France, we right now have to take care of chikungunya or dengue caused by bugs and mosquitoes, something that didn't exist until recently. The idea is to act in all components of capacity, doctrine, organization, resources, training, education, and sustainment. In terms of doctrines, for example, we need to project, as an example, on to studying the change of propagation and mitigation, which has also caused a change at sea. In terms of equipment, General already spoke about infrastructure, which is very important, and methodology was developed by this very same observatory that I mentioned, a methodology which is called Climate Change Evaluation Methodology for Military Camps, to study how to resist the risks of climate change. Anticipating is also important in terms of equipment, because the life cycles of our equipment are between 20 to 50 years. So in the world of the air forces, we consider that when there's lots of evaporation and lots of clouds in the future, this will lead to the risk of ice, which is something we have to take into consideration for future aircrafts through a project which is called EcoCamp. We want to reduce the consumption of energy and water by 40% by 2030. For the team of personnel, we have developed to improve resistance of the military people and also the equipment against extreme temperatures, whether they are very low or very high. what I think is also important and related to the emissions, more and more dual equipment is considered in the industry. In terms of maintenance, for example, the resistance of the battery against these high or extremely high, extremely low temperatures, and also in the aquatic world, where warmer water should take into consideration the accumulation of microorganisms. As for emissions, at this moment, like we heard this morning, our armed forces participate in actions in case of natural disasters, but it's not we're not alone. There are many more organizations involved before the armed forces become involved, and surveillance and rescue actions will be developed. Also, the HDR initiatives to anticipate climate change events such as hurricanes and cyclones. We're very much committed and involved, especially in our overseas territory, the Antillean Islands, or in the Pacific Sea. In terms of emissions, what we are considering is opening the northern route and access to the poles. That also needs the development of training and skills for this kind of areas. Especially this, and the evolution of emissions, of course, has consequences on the training and preparation of the forces. Another objective of this strategy is to contribute to the commitment of France in climate, which is called green defense. We participate in these objectives of the government, mainly to reduce greenhouse gases and protect the environment. The Ministry of Defense is an important responsible part in the emission of these greenhouse gases. So we develop an energy strategy for defense, aiming at limiting the dependence of the armed forces on oil, and at the same time reducing their carbon footprint. France has committed itself to reducing its emissions of gas in 45% between 2020 and 2030. The Ministry of Armed Forces is trying to reduce by 30% its energy consumption and by 50% emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030. Another topic, which is also a sensitive topic, are the regulations and international rights. The Ministry of Armed Forces is also participating in that, because there has to be a balance in this field. For example, in training flights for navigation, we have to ask ourselves whether in some areas we have not got a territory that is so long, like Chile. So the metropolitan France, we have to reserve certain zones, and we have to be closer every time. So the armed forces of France in Latin America and the Pacific, we pay special attention in this area for two reasons. The national interests we have in this area of French Guiana and the French Polynesian area, but also we can see that the impact of climate change in this region is very important strategic priority because, for example, the rising of the sea level is considered 4 times more important than on the rest of the planet. In terms of cooperation, international cooperation, France is strongly committed in the South-Pacific Defense Minister meeting, and they work intimately with Chile and Australia, and they have developed a map of the risks with a horizon towards 2030 to jointly assess the risk level related to cyclones, fishing resources, pandemics, migrations, and the rise of the sea level. We have to also highlight the organization France, which joins France, New Zealand, and Australia to intervene against natural catastrophes, or for example in Tonga, and we have the example of Vanuatu now, where we are facing consequences of 2 cyclones on this island. France also participates in organizations to surveillance of fishing to protect the water resources, and this is also in cooperation with Chile. Like I commented, we have developed a strategy for the poles to take care of the resources of this. I'll go a bit faster. Of the scientific universities, I would like to mention a project which is called Bougainville, because France has worked with the program Plankton Planet and using the deployment of their vessels to use students, to work with students and take samples and analyze microbiology of the ocean. It's an agreement with the Sorbonne University to hire these students in biodiversity. Another interesting example is the Kyoka project, which is studying species of birds to anticipate natural catastrophes such as tsunamis and cyclones. Another project, which is called Micropax, studies migration of aquatic resources. In terms of training, there are many missions, which are the usual missions of the armed forces in the Pacific, but I can also highlight in training the exercises Croix du Sud or Maraba, which every year are being led by France in natural catastrophes, and that takes the consequences in terms of security and safety more and more into consideration. To finalize, in summary, I would like to highlight that the French armed forces are strongly committed in defense and climate, particularly with many applications in this area because of its nature, and to anticipate and avoid conflicts and crises, not only for tomorrow but also for today, and also because through its overseas territories it has experience in these natural catastrophes, but they are becoming stronger and larger. This has all been written down in a national policy which is a lot broader, and also as part of multinational organizations such as the European Union and NATO. In this effort has lots of synergies with Chile, the South American continent, and the Pacific, integrating Antarctica. Thank you very much.
Bien, el turno de nuestra agregada.
Now the turn of our representative from the UK. Please ask to not go over the time that you have allocated. Thank you. I will try to speak quickly as a Chilean, but I imagine I'm not. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As you have already heard, I'm an aviation colonel, Liz Hutchinson, and today more than ever, in the Women's International Day, for me it's a real pleasure as a aggregate of defense of the UK here in Chile to be here with you regarding such an important topic as this one, and specifically to talk a little bit about the British armed forces and the climate change. Why defense should be concerned about this is because climate change is a multiplier of threats that's already reconfiguring the world security and increasing the threats at a time that it gives place to other new threats also, because also defense is our allies and partners confront to the same challenge, which is the need of adapting and becoming resilient to the world where the climate has changed, preserving at the same time the military capacity. And because the armed forces of the UK must adapt themselves in order to provide, fight, and overcome in this era that's more competitive, given that the direct impact of climate change on food and droughts and extreme temperatures, their social economical consequence and their global responses to these still configure the strategic concept where the future conflicts might arise. So how will this affect the capacities and the planning of the Ministry of Defense? Climate change will change where we operate. We open up new areas. The old ones might be closed for us. They will change what we need to operate. The future design, the combination of energies, the options of procurement, the management throughout the lifespan, and the resiliency of our infrastructure platforms must allow our global ambitions. We will also change how we operate. Our tactics, techniques, and procedures should adapt to the new reality, and it will change with who we will operate. We will have to talk about the existing alliances, and with our experience, we will always consider to offer help and leadership where it's needed. It is obvious that climate change and sustainability consider many challenges. For example, there are challenges in the operational environment. While the world becomes more and more hot, extreme hot, the armed forces of the UK, I can never pronounce that word, they will need the capacity of being able to operate in different environments. Also, that we need to deploy mechanical troops in supporting more response to humanitarian, or our acronym is HDAR, and civil emergencies caused by severe and extreme meteorological conditions. And also conflicts coming from poverty, inequality, and access to the resources will create a more extreme environment. Ships, planes, vehicles, and people will have to adapt to a different world. Therefore, defense will have to assess and adapt its capacities in the right way, according to the effects of the climate change and the environment that the armed forces provide. Also, we will have goals and supply chains. there will be challenges. For example, a road to a low carbon emissions economy create temporary risk for the Ministry of Defense, damage our capacity to operate in an efficient way. Net zero will increase the demand of finished goods. The increase of prices or difficulties to obtain materials given the demand of them will negatively impact our supply chain. An example of this that you all know about is lithium, that traditionally has been used in defense equipment, and currently it is mined in large amounts for vehicles and batteries. And other materials that defense use might cost extra, like steel. Defense might have to pay higher prices for the steel through direct price increases or through carbon credits or offset procedures, or this will affect the defense budget by the cost of applying mitigation measures now. A long time for the increase of the responsibilities of that risk that's generated. So what are we doing in defense? We have established a team dedicated to climate change and sustainability. The acronym is CCES. Its role is to integrate sustainability in the heart of defense and also in our decision-making process. We have these three strategic ambitions for the year 2050. The first one, that defense can be adapted to be able to fight and win in more hostile environments. Second, that defense has reduced their emissions and has increased their sustainable activities, and as an area is contributing in order to achieve the legal commitment of have net zero emissions for the year 2050. And the third one, defense acts and is recognized as a world leader in responding to the emerging geopolitical threats that are related with conflicts, which of course get worse with the climate change. Nevertheless, the key principle of focus of defense, it is to preserve capacities and create opportunities in order to have an operational advantage. And now I will finish explaining what we are currently doing. Currently, many projects are being taken forth in defense in order to support the development of innovation needed in order to fight climate change. Amongst this, we include the sustainable support, the acronym SFS, which is the initial response of our defense support to the challenges that climate change brings. This describes the way that we propose ourselves to reduce our emissions and increase sustainability of our operations, to use at maximum the opportunities that the new focuses and technologies offer, and also identify and reduce all vulnerabilities and also risks to the ones we're confronted in the performance of our activity. We have the project this is about solar farms. Luckin Field is the first one of 4 pilot areas, with the hope of increasing its scale and supply of a total of 70 solar farms in all the area managed by the government, by the Army, in a 10 years term. The Army has published its focus on electrifying the battlefield, which establishes detailed plans in order to electrify the battlefield during the next decade. And of course, I will finish with the aviation or Air Force. In January 2023, we used sustainable fuel for airplane combined with normal fuel in order to achieve the first supply in the air with a mixture of aviation fuel and in a C-130 Hercules. This initiative is based on the work carried out in November of last year when RAB completed the first military transportation flight with sustainable fuel. It is the first time that a plane flies in the UK using 100% sustainable aviation fuel in all of its engines. Of course, all of that's the beginning, and there's a lot more to do. But with that, I end my presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to explain my appreciation for the invitation and to thank the organizers. Who contributed for this invitation. Also to all the women for their International Day, that they contribute their talent and sensitivity to make the world a better place. Well, I will invite you we can try to understand climate change and sovereignty. I'd like to highlight that I do not represent in any point, in any way, the Brazilian position. I'm a retired officer. Many of the opinions come from my career as head of the army and later as a national security advisor, but mainly I represent the Sovereign Center. The Climate Sovereign Center, which I asked to a couple of slides to be shown, our webpage. It's a think tank that came out from two parts. First, that there was no dialogue. We did not see dialogue amongst the parties of what we're treating here about climate change, and the ones that worked with sovereignty, which are ourselves, the militaries, the diplomats, and other representatives from the governments, and promote dialogue. The specs were based on stereotypes, as normally happens. And it was needed to propose dialogue in an environment that people were able to be honest, so things could be decided. Many you can imagine, I'm the sovereign side. I'm not from the climate change side or environmental side of things. And we were able to see that there were many points, and we identified them. We were able to see a path forward in the way of a solution. These are not excluding concepts, but these complement each other when they're seen, studied, and interpreted in good faith, and looking toward a future of solutions. In practice, in the little time that we have done, we are surprised by the people who are interested in this, and how this has expanded and has evolved much more than what we would have imagined, and that really made us be able to manage this. We at the beginning choose 7 dialogue axes in order to propose dialogue, which is sovereignty, a critical infrastructure, climate and security, bioeconomy, the Amazon region, of course, climate justice, and external policies. It's all here on our webpage. You can review it on the webpage. And here you can find the different webinars, different papers, and work that we have done. Very well, sovereignty. Well, The General Republic of Brazil states in its first article, defines in its first article, which are the main points in which the Brazilian Republic is based on. The fundamentals are 2 points. One is sovereignty. This is a point that many people do not become aware of, because many times you will read the Brazilian Constitution, which is 200 and something articles. The articles that are interested about the topic that's being looked at. First of all, it defines the general fundamentals of the Republic of Brazil: dignity of the human being, a social value of work and private property, and political spaces. And in this case, this is the initial step that we took in order to understand and promote and invite the different stakeholders for dialogue. So the Climate Sovereignty Center is not a center of environmental discussions only or environmental people. It is a center where we promote dialogue, starting from scientific information and proven information. The government knows all the responsibility that the government has in trying all of these real improvement things, while in other researches these have not been proved. And also the need that to understand that sovereignty is not a difficulty, it's not there to make things difficult in preventing, mitigating climate issues or topics. This is an instrument that you must have. For example, if you can imagine that my country has 8.5 million square kilometers plus 4.5 square kilometers in its exclusive economical area. Out of this 8.5 million square kilometers, 1.7 belong to the Amazon region. It's a huge amount, which at the same time, the richness and the issue that we have. How can we, in order to preserve the environment, in order to react to climate change, if we do not have a government that's strong, that has agencies capable of acting, this is government, the needed government sovereign, which is a must. And the same thing we could say to the other Amazon countries. For example, the Amazonic Pact, which includes 9 countries, Brazil plus 8. Brazil has 62% of the Amazons throughout the Amazon region. And the Amazon region represents in my country 60% of the territory. So Brazil belongs to the Amazons. It's not the other way around, because the Amazon is much, much bigger. Very well. Sovereign states, governments capable of executing their responsibility, they won't be find a solution. So therefore, responsibility of sovereignty is much more than finding a way of engaging, of interacting, keeping sovereignty in order to cooperate in the international scenario. Because climate phenomena impact all of us. It doesn't respect sovereignties. Doesn't consider also borders, or it has to have a passport. Things go through the borders very quickly. The problem that we had is that how to reconcile the needs of confronting climate change and environmental problems with the functional points of sovereignty and also national interest. while we're not organized, there won't be any possibility that national interest and sovereignty could be negotiated or in some way achieved. Brazil understands its responsibility, from what I know from society, its responsibility in the environmental and climate change. I can make sure that it's a very sensitive view of my society. There's no possibility of an administration that can take the policy to negatively confront climate issues or environmental issues because they won't have a popular support.
Como les hablé de las dimensiones brasileñas.
This is like the Brazilian divisions, as I mentioned. We have 217 million of inhabitants that will try and allow, and I like postear because it includes much more things than just evolving to be better, has a social political sense, economical. I think that this is a richer term for this. In this sense, analyzing the Brazilian armed forces, these are armed forces dedicated mainly via the legal instruments in order to prevent and preserve the territory and the national assets and the national heritage, of course, and its people, of course. It is important to understand that the Brazilian armed forces is also the armed forces, I imagine, of all South America. And excuse me for talking about only South America. We're thinking about the same hemisphere. There's no common cultures or roots. To try to understand Brazil in the same environment that Trinidad and Tobago or Puerto Rico, it's very difficult for me. This is hard. And the issue is that when we look at South America, that has been said here, has the social symmetries, which are the deepest ones, very deep ones. And Marek, we also look to the region that's mostly stable of the world. Remember yourselves, how many times did you have to update your geographical knowledge regarding Europe, Africa, and Asia during the last 30 years? And what changed in South America? So, in some way, with all the issues we have, with all the difficulties that we have found a way of living with sovereignties which is very respectful, which is stable, where we don't have exclusion borders, we don't have any wired fences or walls, we don't have armed borders, and that the territorial divisions are all subject to international forums, not military disputes. This is something that has been built by all the South American countries. We understand the position that Brazil has, the responsibility that Brazil has. That's why many times Brazil is much more than a peaceful. Yeah, Brazil is a country that provides peace because it's capable as a giant of South America. Talking about the size, the economy, and the population, they're all countries. And we have the role, right, that we perform in South America and this region, and that's why for the world peace and the responsibility that we have with the rest of the South American countries of environmental issues and also climate changes. So therefore, the word is cooperation. Our armed forces, our defense systems.
Me galopes, vamos a galopar más fuerte. Así que la responsabilidad.
The responsibility that we have is to promote integration and cooperation, to be capable of sharing knowledge, to be capable of sharing solutions, and also be able to mutually help each other when it's needed. Much more than dividing up South American borders, they bring us together much more than dividing us. Right now we're having a trans-ocean pathway which comes from the Paraná, comes to Chile. President
Conocerla. Y así que
so what we need is to understand that the armed forces can help very much, but it's not their mission. It's an additional mission, giving the logistic infrastructure, giving the presence throughout the entire territory. In the Brazilian case, and the only representative of the government many times in the forest places of the Amazon. But we have to reinforce the capacity of the governments, of 8 government agencies which are responsible in confronting these threats. There's a lot of concern of things that we consider wrong, to look for guilty people before solutions, to blame people, to question sovereignty, as some representatives have done through a long time now. Isolate important stakeholders but because of national interests which are not very transparent. So, the worst thing that can happen is to manage military in subject or topics in something diplomatic or political. The worst thing you can do is that we do not have the capacity of understanding as societies, as neighboring societies that share the same area of the world. But until now, we will be here for a long time, I hope. But we have to add up efforts, we have to add up intentions, we have to go to the actions that are interesting for our people. At the end, it belongs to them, that they can have all the capacities that give the armed forces. So that's how we see this in Brazil. The effects of the climate change, of course, impact all countries. What differs, though, is the capacity to react to that. Very well. We also have to add up efforts, be able to confront this. Thank you so much, and I hope that I've met my time for my presentation.
Bueno, finalmente dejo con usted al capitán de navío.
Finally, I leave the floor to Navy Captain.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank AthenaLab for the invitation. I'm the last speaker today, so this will maybe be the most difficult to get through. I'm subdirector, depending on the national authority, Maritime Authority, which is part of the Chilean Navy. The Maritime Authority and naval power are all together in the Navy, so we have several functions, shared functions, and regarding climate change, they have an internal perspective, institutional perspective, and also external, how the Maritime Authority relates to different organizations and entities. I would like to start talking about the sea. First of all, to talk about the importance of the oceans and relate them to climate change. First, we have to highlight that physically, practically 70% of our planet, of the surface of the Earth, is oceans, and 93% of available water on our planet is seawater, which is a very important datum because we have a water crisis, and this is an important source to obtain water for different activities. Our country, particularly our country, is part of the Pacific Basin. It's an ocean that contains 50% of salt water in the world, and it's also a basin that strategically communicates different powers, maybe the greatest economic powers of the world, and where several activities of high commercial value are carried out, not only in the sea, but also fishery and recreational activities, and a great population that lives around the coast of the Pacific Ocean. In this sense, our country occupies 4,300 kilometers of coast, which also means an important responsibility. We're talking about 3 long kilometers, much more than our surface in the country. So we have a larger territory on sea than over land. And this ocean has a great riches in living resources. Our country is part of several fishing organizations. The New York Agreement, Pacific Agreement, the Camelar, and if we extend the surface and the responsibility for the Navy, we're talking about an enormous surface that leads us towards the South Pole and oceanic territories. First, we have to ask, why do we relate the sea and climate change and the importance of oceans? Because these large areas of responsibility also generate the need to interact with important organizations for our country. It's important to have a professional navy with the resources and capacities necessary to be able to control these areas. How do we relate the ocean to climate change and defense? I would like to highlight some characteristics of the ocean which make it very relevant in terms of climate change. First of all, the intake of CO2. There is literature that says that it's called the Great Blue Lung, the ocean. This refers to the capacity of the ocean to take in CO2 and liberate O2, oxygen. So it's very important, together with the woods and forests, to take in CO2 and liberate oxygen, one of the greatest problems on the earth. Transport, 90% of international trade takes place overseas, partly. This is fuel, food and other goods. coastal populations, 80% of the world population lives close to the sea. So it's subject to all the effects that the rise of the sea level can have, because they live close to coastal areas. It has an essential role for different activities, not only commercial transport, fishery and sports activities that take place on the ocean. And finally, when we talk about food safety, that was mentioned earlier, it is a source of great biodiversity that also contains food reserves that have to be protected, that are very fragile and have to be protected. Therefore, we can relate defense to climate change and the ocean. We have oceans that are necessary and are a source to maintain the conditions as a source of resources, to capture CO2. They're also fragile, and therefore we need professional defense with resources and skills to be able to operate in these vast spaces. For our country, I would like to highlight another aspect. United Nations elaborated criteria to react to climate change, 9 criteria. Our country contains 7. I won't mention the 9 criteria, but this makes that our country is among the 15 most vulnerable countries, vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Therefore, it is very important for our country at institutional level and as a country itself. In this scenario, our country indeed has measured the situation and has responded early. In 1994, we have to remember that the framework of the United Nations on climate change was carried out, the first initiative on climate change. Our country participated in that, and in 2015, this ends up in the COP21 and the Paris Agreement. The Sustainable Development Goals are developed as well, 17. We saw this in a previous presentation, but these are the roadmap that was generated in 2015 to make progress in concrete measures for climate change. And in this sense, regarding to the ocean, we have to highlight that the Sustainable Development Goal 14 is about submarine life. And the goal is that if we analyze all the other goals, it's the only one that is cross-cutting and is related to all of the other. This means that the ocean is very important. It has to be protected and defended, and the importance of the effects of climate change. In general, all these international initiatives, the framework agreement, COP21, the Paris Agreement, have 3 common goals: to increase the adaptation, to promote resilience, and 3, finally, to reduce emission of greenhouse gases. This is the international aspect. How do we as a country assume these challenges of climate change? The current environmental policy is called turquoise environmental policy. Why? Because of course it's the color of the sea. It is also an analog to the green color of the woods and the blue of the oceans, and this way we have turquoise. So the national policy is a policy that considers, regarding climate change, the oceans as a vital element. And in that sense, the Ministry of Environment is a focus point regarding all policies of climate change. As for defense, in 2021, the latest defense policy was generated, which incorporates among its concepts the need to consider in planning and strategy for policies the effects and considerations of climate change at level of the policies for defense. They have been incorporated. The Navy is incorporated in the environmental problems in 2014. This year, the first environmental policy for the Navy is developed. In 2016, the Climate Change Committee is created at institutional level, at the highest level of the institution. And this committee seeks to generate a framework to develop concrete actions at institutional level regarding climate change. 2 years later, in 2018, the climate change policy in the Navy is created. In 2019, the first institutional climate change action plan is created, with concrete measures that start to be implemented from 2019 onwards. So what are the main orientations? Increase energy efficiency, promote using renewable energy, and reducing, especially in the fleet, the possibility to contaminate the environment, especially close to the sea, on the sea. As a representative of the Department of Maritime Interests, I explain here, in parallel with environmental policies, a climate change office is created that I participate in, with 4 main functions. First, it becomes the technical entity that supports the Institutional Climate Change Committee in the aspects where they need support. It has the mission to diffuse at international, national level what the main tasks are that the Maritime Authority is carrying out regarding climate change. And 2 aspects that are very important: the generation of strategic alliances, which I think has been redlined through all the presentations. Climate change is not a problem that one organization or one person can face. It's a problem that touches all of us, and it has to be faced all together. And this office is in charge of generating strategic alliances at national and international level. And as a maritime authority, we also have a direct relationship with international maritime authorities. We're part of the OMI in this year, and this office also carries out follow-up of all those guidelines, national and international guidelines. To finalize, I would like to highlight not only theoretical things, but also 3 concrete actions that we have been carrying out, which are very important. The first one is environmental monitoring. Though the Navy does not carry out research on climate change, except for some specific research, we have to remember that the Navy has a great capacity and a history in data collection, oceanographic and maritime meteorological data. We have data on wind meteorological conditions. We've had them for over 10 years, and together with this, our geographical service has a long history of gathering geographical data through these stations along our entire coast. As a maritime authority, Director Mar 30 years ago started the observation of the coastal area, which has enabled characterization of certain parameters of the water column in over 50 bays or maritime or coastal areas of interest. So we have historic data that are the base for the possibility to generate studies with historic perspective on the effects of climate change. Here we can add scientific cruises performed together with CONA and the Geographic Service of the Navy, and our vessel in Cape Horn, a first class. So as a first point, I would like to highlight the permanent task that the Navy carries out. It's been doing this for several decades, and that it does every day regarding data collection data of all kind on the meteorological characteristics that we can find at sea and different parameters of the water column, which, like I said, are the base for baselines and to conduct any study to know conditions and foresee any effects of climate change. The second concrete point I would like to mention is the interaction with other organizations. The Navy, mainly through the Climate Change Office, is related to several organizations. This relationship is vital. Isolated work doesn't help to fight the effects of climate change and mitigate them, and in that sense, interaction of the Climate Change Office and not only with governmental entities such as the Ministry of Environment, Pesca, the Fishing Promotion Service, but also the private world, associations of shipbuildings, builders, trade unions of artisanal fishing, water associations. We have a large salmon association in the south of our country, so it's very important. And there are many working groups and working instances that we participate in to have a great universe and to incorporate different perspectives. Of course, there are different concerns, governmental entities, commercial activities, recreational activities, and the academic world. We have agreements and we constantly work with the academic world. And there is also the availability and the feasibility to exchange data that the Navy collects periodically to share with academic or research institutions. And the third point and final point, I would like to highlight the contribution the Maritime Authority gives to OMI, is specifically the influence on greenhouse gas emissions. We have talked about them and what they represent, and a great percentage come from sea transport, these commercial vessels. And in this sense, there is a commitment of this international organization to reduce emission of fossil fuels, CO2 by fossil fuels. So generally the fuel is less refined, which has higher effect on climate change. Last year we reduced these greenhouse gas effects, and the great challenge that we have towards 2050 is the reduction by 50% of the emissions of CO2 coming from sea transport. These are the three specific actions that I wanted to share with you. Am I okay in time? Okay, you're 1 minute over already. So to finalize, I would like to say that the Navy has been collecting data for a long time, also protecting the sea, preserving resources. We will continue doing this, but there are challenges. In 10 seconds, I would like to show you some questions that we might have to ask. What are the great emphasis? What are the largest problems that could become worse? A critical port infrastructure, defense, and also commercial. Our country depends a lot on the sea, and great part of fuel and merchandise get to the ports, arrive at ports. So it's important to think of the ports of the future and climate change. Of course, we have to maintain joint work, propulsion of vessels. I think that's very important. What will be the propulsion in the future? What will the vessels of the coming 20, 30 years look like? Of course, protection of biodiversity. And the agreement in New York has already been approved. It was approved last weekend regarding new control entities to control at high sea. Maybe these are spaces with less control. Somebody will have to protect and control high sea in the future, on the short term. And finally, safety, which is something that was talked about. Which are the implications on safety? How will climate change affect? Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. And a warm round of applause. Thank you very much. I will now give the General Coordinator with you. I would like to thank all our speakers.